Hi, my name is Allison Bell, and I am going to be presenting on the contemporary applications of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. So, the presentation objectives are to evaluate Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior and then the expansion into current research, specifically through the contemporary application of relational frame theory. So, we're going to do a quick overview of verbal behavior, who Skinner is, and then we're going to move into that contemporary application and then end with a couple of questions. So, verbal behavior, Skinner, he had a career from 1930 to 1990, which he passed away in. And if you are a behavior analyst that has been on social media at all in the last 5 years, the rallying cry of BF is my BFF is all over social media. This is actually a picture of me and two of my behavior analyst friends with a cardboard cutout of Skinner that actually said on the bottom of it, BF is my BFF. And this was taken at the Association for Professional Behavior Analysts in 2016 in Washington, D.C. So what we're really going to be talking about specifically for regards to Skinner is verbal behavior and that publication in 1957. So this is one of his seminal publications because it changed the way that behavior analysis looked at language, and even other disciplines looked at language. So the uniqueness that came from verbal behavior is that language acquisition is influenced by environmental events just as other behaviors are influenced. So framing of language through or as an operant behavior. So it was really that shift in definition of verbal behavior that was the uniqueness of this publication, and that functional analysis of verbal behavior. So function over form. Didn't matter what it looked like, but we wanted to know what the function of it was. So a quick review of the elementary operants that were presented in Skinner or in verbal behavior: the man, tacticoic, interverbal, audience relation, and textual. This is actually a quick little handy flow chart that a friend of mine had published in her study group, and she gave me permission to republish it here. But I found that it's really super helpful as a quick guide to understanding those classifications. So when we're speaking about Skinner and the analysis of verbal behavior, those 6 elementary operants have to be understood in order to evaluate his application to language. So these operants are identified and analyzed in terms of their relation between the controlling variables. There's obviously more operants than the 6 that are listed on the left. So the duplicate and codic that Michael published. So for the sake of time and clarity, we're actually only going to review the man, tacticoic, and interverbal, and we're going to hit the other 2 very briefly. So the man. So when we're looking at man, the antecedent is always a motivating operation, and the consequence is that very specific reinforcement. And so let's watch a quick video. This is actually a video of my son with one of my RBTs from several years ago. I think this was 3 years ago now. But we're going to watch a quick video of him with manning.
Green. Green. Oh, there you go. Yellow ball. There.
So we really like this example because the first one gives us an example of an impure man. So he was asked what he wanted, and then she was prompting him to give him a complete sentence and the color and the item. The second example, though, is a much better example of a pure man because he's just requesting the yellow ball without being asked what he wants, and because he's motivated to match the colors to the little toy that he's playing with. And so I feel like this is a really good example of manding. So the next one that we're going to look at is the tact. And so the antecedent for a tact is nonverbal stimulus. And the consequence is that generalized condition non-specific reinforcement. So we're going to watch a video of my daughter, who is 2.5, and she's reading a book. And we'll talk about it in just a second.
A dog.
So this is a really cute video of my daughter because she saw a little puppy dog that was sleeping in the book, and she immediately labeled dog. So when we're looking at pure tact, the verbal behavior is under the control of the thing that's actually in the physical environment. So when Madeline saw that picture, she labeled it. So the next up is echoic. So the antecedent is another stimulus or another organism's verbal behavior, and the consequence is that generalized condition non-specific reinforcement. So again, this is going to be a video of my daughter. And we'll pull that up real quick.
Good job. Hey, hey. I love you.
So in the past, I have reinforced my daughter's echoic behavior when I start a sentence with I. And so this is a game that we play with the I love you, and we're matching that prosody and the pitch through those. So when you're analyzing echoics, you must have point-to-point correspondence in that formal similarity. And so really the I and the you in that one would have those. So if we look at the next operant that we're looking at, the interverbals. The antecedent is again that other verbal behavior, and that consequence is again that generalized condition non-specific reinforcement. But this one does not have that point-to-point correspondence. So again, this is my son with one of my technicians several years ago doing some interverbal tasks.
All right. What are you working for? What is that? M&M's. You're working for M&M's. Okay. When you're thirsty, you get a. Good job. Your mom's name is Allison. Nice work.
So she was doing fill-ins with him, and obviously he's very verbal at this point. I think he was 4 or 5 at the time. But those interverbals, they don't have that point-to-point correspondence. So when she said your mom's name is, his answer of Allison did not match what she had said. So that was a quick review of the four of the elementary operands, and very quickly we're going to go over textual and audience relations. So textual is just reading, but it does not require that comprehension. So that written word dog evokes them saying dog, and then the audience relation is just the influence of the audience on the speaker. So in college, I spent a lot of time in the library, and the librarians will punish you if you use loud voices. So the strength of that response was decreased. The context and the environment influence that strength of the behavior that they're engaging in. So when we're looking at verbal behavior, there also was those more complex components of verbal behavior, specifically the multiple control. So the multiple control really does muddy up what we were just trying to neatly delineate by those controlling variables. So sometimes there are several effective stimulus or motivating operations, and typically those control more than one form of the response. And so humor is a really great, especially sarcasm is a really great example of this. When we're looking at the autoclitic, those are definitely more complex components of Skinner's analysis, and they're meant to modify the function of other verbal behaviors. So we have the descriptive, the qualifying, the quantitative, the manipulative, and the relational, and they all have functional descriptions, which means that they are controlled by certain conditions. So if we quickly go through those, descriptive is being controlled by the conditions they are emitted, so it's meant to describe. A qualify is being controlled by the motivating operation, which qualifies a primary verbal operant, such as to extend or to negate. The quantified being controlled by the modification of the listener's MO, so gives more precision to the meaning for the listener. The manipulative, the motivating operation is again one of those controlling variables, so manning to the listener to respond in a certain way, such as hear me out. Relational, again, that one's a motivating operation, so manning to the listener to respond to the relationships between some operands. So the self-control of verbal behavior really digs into language as an operant. So happens, so verbal behavior happening both covertly or privately and overtly or publicly. This section's really at odds with other components of Skinner's philosophies because of the words he used specific to like consideration of certain specific activities. If language truly is an operant and the environment really does set the occasion for specific responses, considerations wouldn't be needed. The self-control, self-editing, and self-strengthening are all noteworthy when we start exploring relational frame theory. So that was a very quick rundown of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, but the concept of verbal operants is obviously still a common topic of investigation in academia. So the analysis of verbal behavior is a journal that is a testament to that. So there has been several studies recently that investigates children with autism spectrum by themselves, including 172 studies across the span of 16 years. And additionally, there's explorations of the most appropriate methods to train these operants and the populations within ASD or across other diagnoses and how we are appropriate to teach them. They all relate back to Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. So the continued reference to terminology that was established in verbal behavior it's evident that Skinner is still influential in the current academia, especially as the analysis of verbal behavior has shifted its goal to closing the gap between applied research and practice. So there's still an attempt to bridge that between the theoretical and foundational research to the clinical practices of behavior analysis through evidence-based and empirically sound methodologies. So let's do a quick little transition to talk about the timeline. So in 1957, Skinner wrote Verbal Behavior. In 1984, he published an operant analysis of problem solving. In 1990, Stidman started publishing about the equivalence relationship and where do they come from. And then in 2001, Hayes, Barnes, Holmes, and Roche published the relational frame theory, a post-Skinnerian account of human language and cognition. So in the 1984 analysis of problem behavior, or the analysis of problem solving, started the path into cognition and understanding more complex human behaviors through operant conditioning. So this was really just the tip of the iceberg when we're looking at those more complex human behaviors and language. So in 1990, and all of the work that Stidman did through the 1970s and the 1980s on stimulus equivalence, it was really exciting for behavior analysts at the time because of the implications and the applications of that to reading comprehension, because again, that was just another expansion of problem solving. So there was a lot of progress towards that more comprehensive understanding of complex behaving and the correspondence between words, things, what we do, what we say, and those rules and contingencies. So this truly opened the door for functional contextualism and relational frame theory, which we're about to get into. In 2001, while this was not the first reference to relational frame theory, it was the one that put it on the map because this was the most extended account of it, and has since been cited over 3,500 times according to Google Scholar. So let's get into what relational frame theory is and why it's cool. So relational frame theory has a bunch of components to it, but the functional contextualism theory is based on derived stimulus relations and those relational frames that language and cognition are understood as. So the radical behaviorism it was part of a radical behavioristic approach through the use of terms, the psychological events. So they characterize behavior as psychological events, which is obviously very similar to how B.F. Skinner defines behavior. So psychological events are just anything that a person does through that are observable by others, such as waving or running, which is that public overt, or those that are not observable by others, such as thinking and feeling, which is that private and covert. Those would definitely map onto how Skinner was defining and understanding behavior. There is a lot to relational frame theory, and the followers have reworded to help clarify when they're talking about behavior, language, and cognition. But it really is an extension and a contextualization of radical behaviorism. It's not a rejection. So when we're starting to look at what does that functional contextualism mean, the context, when we're talking about contextualism and context, just means that the current setting or environment, which is that physical, social, biological, cultural environment around that event, and the learning history, so interactions with the environment over time. So there is this emphasis on action words rather than nouns or things, which is unique to functional contextualism and relational frame theory. Another unique feature that shows that it's an evolution from radical behaviorism rather than a rejection of it is that manipulation of the context or the manipulation of the environment. So psychological events or mental events, as other disciplines would understand them, cannot predict or influence psychological events, and that's one of the primary goals of functional contextualism. Okay, so couple of different problems. The problem is that Skinner's account required a history of reinforcement. So what about novel behaviors that have not been reinforced in the past? How are those learned, and how are more complex relations understood and analyzed? So one of the solutions to that is that derived stimulus relations. So relations between two or more stimulus that are not directly trained or taught and not based on the physical properties that can be sensed through the five senses. This is really that Barnes, Holmes et al. 2004. So derived stimulus relations look an awful lot like stimulus equivalents that we saw from Stidman in the 1980s and the 1990s, and they are similar, or at least they're related. So stimulus equivalence is the trained portion of our stimulus equivalence triangle that we have down here, the black arrows. So if we train that a graph is equal to the glasses and that a rat on a wheel is equal to the glasses, we can get equivalence or sameness from that. And that's going to be our orange arrows, right? those are the sameness. So those are not all the same. The derived stimulus relations are those untrained yellow arrows. So we never train someone that the graph is equal to the rat, but you can derive that from this relationship. So if we teach the super cool glasses to the graph and the rat to the super cool glasses, we'll get the yellow arrows. So according to Skinner's theory of reinforcement, the relationship between the graph and the rat is unaccounted for because it was never part of the organism's reinforcement history, but derived stimulus relations picks up that analysis and provides an explanation for it. Also, because of the complex relational networks that we as behavior analysts are involved in, we likely immediately associated the icons as related to our BFF, Mr. Skinner. So let's explore relational frames a little bit in detail here. So again, we have our fun super cool glasses graph and rat on a wheel. So relational frames are used to understand that language and cognition, but they have to have three important properties. So mutual entailment. So we've taught A to B, A will be connected to B, and B will also be connected to A. So our graph is related to our glasses, but our glasses are also related to our graph. This one only requires two stimulus relations. So we're only looking at the glasses and the graph rather than all three. But when you have that combinatorial entailment, it's the combination of all three or more of those stimulus relations. So we know that the graph is related to the glasses, and we know that the rat is related to the glasses. So then we know that the graph is somehow related to our rat. But then there's also this transformation of stimulus functions. So the stimulus function of these three symbols has been transformed because of the complex relational networks that we participate in as behavior analysts. If I were to use the same relational frame in a presentation to teachers, they may, because of their relational networks, transform the function to that of a biologist like Darwin. However, because of the context in which this frame, the presentation to a behavior analyst, is presented, we relate it to Skinner because he's our BFF. So relational frame theory also gets into more complex contextual cues, such as stimulus functions, C-rules and C-funcs, but is much more in depth and less related to Skinner and how this applies to the understanding of language. So it's all cool and all, but let's get moving on to how does this relate to Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. So we're going to look at those operants that we talked about earlier. Barnsholm et al. 2000 gave a really awesome synthesis of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior compared to relational frame theory. So they actually understand each of the operants as two different types of operants. So the development of manding since the time has passed from 1957 has led to more questions as behaviors become more complex. So how do we account for all of those that have not been previously reinforced? Does the physical object actually resemble something that has been paired or has never been paired? So there's two types of mands. There's that nonverbal and the verbal. So there's the nonverbal has been explicitly reinforced in the past based on the specific object. So if my daughter asks for an apple, she knows that this thing means an apple. But the verbal, the manded stimulus participates in a relational frame with other stimuli. So if she were to ask for fruit, that would also result in an apple, and now that fruit has been related to the apple. So in the presence of arbitrarily applicable relational respondings with or without behavioral processes that define a verbal relation, the absence of explicit reinforcement through response induction, stimulus generalization, or respondent conditioning does not define a verbal event. So the Barnsholm article labeling the two types of an operant was an attempt to clarify, but for me, and I'm going to guess other behavior analysts, it really muddied it more. And I really didn't get an explanation from that article. But let's move on to the tact. So again, they are characterizing the tact as two different types of tacts. The nonverbal, which has been explicitly reinforced based on the specific item in the past, and the tacted stimulus participating in a relational network with other stimuli. So Barnsholm et al. 2000 actually said that pure tacting is really rare, but analyzing text based on that should still happen. So if during playtime with my daughter, she labels an airplane because I've taught her by labeling and reinforcing that when she labels it, it's a nonverbal type of tact. However, when I say that some airplanes or jets following that, the airplanes and the jets now participate in a relational frame with that toy plane. In doing so, we're making a clear functional distinction between the formally similar responses that arise from very different behavioral histories. So the echoic. There's two types of classifications of that echoic, the verbal and the nonverbal. So the nonverbal is the simple infant-like imitations of the word, so that don't participate in relational frames of coordination. So echoing for the sake of echoing, but not understanding what it is that we're echoing. The verbal does participate in frames of coordination. So when you're analyzing units of echoic behavior, behavior is defined by the vocal correspondence in the relational frames. So here's another video of my daughter. This one I was actually taken without this assignment in mind when she came upstairs to talk to me. Say, see daddy.
See, Daddy.
So this would be a verbal echoic because she understands. She actually came upstairs to ask me to help her put her shoes on because she wanted to go outside to see daddy. So when I said see daddy, she said see daddy, but she knew that that meant that she needed to go downstairs and actually see her daddy.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at the interverbal, again, there's two types of those interverbals. There's one that does not participate in the relational frames and one that does. So when you're analyzing interverbals from this relational frame theory, functional contextualism lens, the organism can appropriately respond to a stimulus that participates in that frame. So if we're talking about the ABCs, if I ask my daughter to say the ABCs, she can probably say them. She probably does not understand that A always comes before B and B comes before C, or that C comes after A. So it would probably be a non-verbal frame. It's just say your ABCs, she can say ABCs and move on. So quickly, there are a couple other elementary verbal operants that we talked about. So that textual, there's those two types of textuals, the nonverbal textual, where the speaker is just uttering words that have point-to-point correspondence with those written materials, but they don't participate in relational frames, or those verbal that do. So if you're talking about, as I read my daughter a bedtime story, it's a verbal textual verbal operant if I'm able to describe those events with synonyms. It's a nonverbal textual if I'm just regurgitating the contents of the reading. So if I'm just reading for the sake of reading to her and I can't actually tell you what I just read, it's a nonverbal textual. So, and the last one that Barnes-Holm et al. Gave us was the autoclitic, which I think is really interesting. So those two types of autoclitic behavior. There's the ones that are explicitly reinforced and the verbal autoclitics. So those ones that do participate in those relational frames. Autoclitics give language its complexity. So with all of that very quick rundown of what relational frame theory has to say about the verbal operants, there are obviously people in the field that have very, very passionate critiques of this. So we're going to quickly go over a couple of those critiques. So Palmer was probably one of the first ones, or at least the most well-known one, that really just questioned, is this necessary? So his article, Data in Search of the Principle, a review of relational frame theory, a post-Skinnerian account of human language and cognition, he accuses Hayes and Barnes-Holm and Hayes of just a dismissal of his interpretation, a dismissal of Skinner's interpretation as it was unproductive and flawed. I don't necessarily agree that they dismissed Skinner's interpretation. I think that they just tried to evolve it. So there was also that Palmer brought up the conceptual discussion was incomplete, and is a new understanding of a new principle of behavior really necessary? Because it sounds like this theory is just a repackaged combination of those elementary verbal operants. And if it is that, then verbal behavior underlies relational behavior and it's not defined by it. So really Palmer was stepping up to the plate to defend Skinner and the argument that relational behavior needs to be incorporated into Skinner's analysis rather than be a replacement to it. So Hayes and Barnes-Holm obviously responded to this and basically said that relational operands and those processes and the implications of them, they contacted the contingencies. The defense that they had against it is that Palmer's arguments were illogical and that Skinner himself would likely disagree with Palmer. The mechanistic philosophy does not bode well even for functional behavior analytic approach. So they argued that if the critique of their science was appropriate and accurate, then really he had a problem with behavior analysis in general. So there had been a lot of other articles that had been published giving critiques of relational frame theory. The Fox and Gross in 2009 really did give a good overview of all of the critiques, but it does need updated since this hasn't been updated in almost 11 years, and there has been more. There's been more to it since then. So there's two primary concerns why it's been such a controversial topic, because it's substantially different from Skinner's, even if it is an extension, and the implications of it, if it's accurate, have really important changes to our field. So the best thing about relational frame theory is that at a point in time, this was at that point in time in 2009, it was an important philosophical and conceptual discussion that was happening. And because of the novelty of it, why was it necessary at the time? They really did a good job of talking about why it was beyond stimulus equivalence and how it was different from that, because Sidman's was primarily descriptive, and relational frame theory is really a behavioral explanation for the phenomenon that was formed rather than a descriptive one. RFT also is more conservative when accounting for equivalence, so there's no new principles at the level of the process, but rather at the level of the outcome. The scope of RFT is much more broad than the stimulus equivalence, and there's a wider range of relations than just equivalence. So lastly, as part of the critiques, they have done citation analyses talking about how many articles are empirical, how many meet relational frame theory, all of those things, but there's substantial contributions based on Diamond et al. And O'Connor in 2017. There's been over 500 articles published that have some type of inclusion of relational frame theory topics. So Diamond and May actually responded in 2017 to O'Connor and saying that they actually used too broad of a definition of what empirical was and too broad of a search criteria. So what are the advantages of RFT? So there's actually an Association for Contextual Behavioral Science that was founded in 2005 and then incorporated in 2006. On their website, they have a wealth of information on relational frame theory and the clinical application through acceptance and commitment therapy. But quickly, let's run down some of the advantages that they cite as advantages of relational frame theory. It's parsimonious, it's precise. It really is the merger of cognitive psychology and behavior analysis, and it has a much wider and broader scope that can be studied. The principles of relational frame theory are also directly observable, which is really important if you're looking at a behavior analytic extension. So RFT is also firmly based in empirical research. We have 30 years of data and there's been no contradictions on it. RFT also has direct applied and clinical applications that are not apparent in other accounts of human language. It's also generative. So there's a lot of lines of research that we're gonna learn about quickly. And it leads to lots of innovative and new approaches. It's also progressive. So it builds on everything that is known about basic behavioral principles. But it's also a really interesting application. So it's a really interesting methodology that the studies are used to present on. So Skinner himself said that radical behaviorism would eventually die and become part of the mainstream understanding of behavior. And I think that's what's happening here. It's also coherent and it's led to a really cool assessment of language through PEAK. So let's talk a little bit about the utility of relational frame theory. So Barnes-Holm et al. 2000 gives the RFT how to use it with children with developmental disabilities. McCullough has the 2014 article that's based on rule-governed behavior. And then there's RFT's role in a behavior analytic account of human language and cognition, and just with children in general through Belisle. So that's what makes this such an interesting development, is the extension of behavior analysis. So in that 2000 article, how and why it's necessary, Belisle. So then we move over to what's promoting emergence of advanced knowledge. So Dixon et al. 2015, what's the relationship between the VB-MAP and the PEAK? So there's strong correlations between the PEAK total scores and the VB-MAP scores, but there's also a ceiling effect with the VB-MAP because it only included 138 of the 368 skills that were on the PEAK. Dixon in 2018 also suggests that participants mastered target skills through the training phase, and that VB-MAP test probes showed an increasing trend and that they maintained over time, which may not have been seen with just using the VB-MAP. So Dixon is one of the creators of the PEAK training, but he's not the only researcher on this. It's become more popular over the last 3 to 5 years. There's been a lot of additional independent studies. So these articles are really just the tip of the iceberg, but offer some research lines that will continue into the future. So as we've discussed, there's an expanded scope of practice. While ABA has started to narrow into just autism, relational frame theory has a world of relational networks to study on how they relate to language and cognition. So in the analysis of verbal behavior article, journal, the applied research to practice gap, that was really going to be the focus for the future, and disseminating a unified message and disagreeing without being disagreeable. So relational frame theory and the functional contextualism crowd have really separated themselves through its own journal, the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Sciences. However, there's still plenty of publications in the Analysis of Verbal Behavior and the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior and JAVA. So let's talk about the future directions of relational frame theory. These are really interesting lines, and they're all very different, which I think is really interesting. So Stapleton, 2020, they actually applied relational frame theory to rule-governed behavior through COVID-19, and why understanding and knowing how to implement and still choosing not to follow a rule, like mask wearing. So this is a really cool line of research because it can lean into other rule-governed / important public health measures and how those apply to relational frame theory. Barnes-Holm, 2020, the focus was on the psychological processes of psychotherapy. So this goes into another discipline's fields of study. And then Belisle and Dixon, 2020, they respond to the critiques of Peake. And there's a lot of critiques of Peake out there. But Witts, 2018, he had 30 criticisms that are more appropriately framed as criticism of behavior and analytic research rather than just Peake. And the two that were real criticisms that actually were specifically directed at Peake were minor and not fatal. So they're actually implementing larger scale initiatives to produce more empirical support for that specific assessment. So the Ruiz et al. 2020 article is actually going into anxiety disorders through repetitive negative thinking and the use of acceptance and commitment therapy. And they actually found no adverse effects, and the brief repetitive negative thinking, the R&T focused ACT protocols, have a lot of utility in that specific area. So each of these is addressing very different socially significant problems from a relational frame theory standpoint. So RFT truly does increase the scope of practice of what can be considered behaviorable, even if it does repackage and address psychological events. So the future is bright for relational frame theory, and over the coming years, more and more research will likely continue to support this theory, and the implications on the real world are endless. So let's quickly do some Q&A. Does the progression of RFT mean that there was something wrong with Skinner's analysis? No. He actually predicted that radical behaviorism would eventually die. And I think this is not his death, this is just the incorporation into more complex and thorough theories. Does this mean that BF is no longer our BFF? Absolutely not. He is still responsible for the shift of psychology to the mind of the observable, the psych from the mind to the observable, and that evolution into relational frame theory has the potential to help merge cognitive psychology and behavior analysis in ways that haven't been able to in the past. So I still think he's a cool guy. ACT and Peake seem really, really complicated. Do I have to learn about them as a behavior analyst? Absolutely do. Our behavior analytics certification board says that we need to stay up to date on the literature. And so do we have to love it? Absolutely not. But we are welcome to examine the flaws and engage in scholarly endeavors to make those flaws known if we don't agree with it. And lastly, how does relational frame theory potentially apply to the practice working with children and families impacted by autism spectrum disorder? So I briefly mentioned the promoting emergence of skills, the Peake training. We also have acceptance and commitment therapy that I think has really awesome applications to our families that are impacted by autism. So Evelyn Gould has actually put out an ACT for parents of children with autism training, and it is really interesting and has really awesome implications for the continued implementation of parent training in ABA for children with autism. So, thanks. And there's the reference list.